Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session of International Colloquium. My name is Li-Xin Li. I am the Chair-elect of Commission for Global Dimension of Student Development. We would like to take a moment to welcome you to the third session of 2024 International Colloquium. This year, we are proud to present a series of 4 webinars around the topic of social-emotional well-being and exploration of international graduate students' voices. This event is sponsored by ACPA's Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development and is dedicated to giving international graduate students a voice related to their experiences in the United States while completing their graduate studies and seeking professional and faculty appointments in higher education. We hope that their voices will provide administrators, staff, and faculty working in the higher education with insights to the ways in which they can best be supported throughout their academic journeys and career transitions. Related to ACPA's mission of supporting and fostering learning through the generation and sharing of knowledge and ACPA's strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization, our commission would like to acknowledge the indigenous land that each of us occupies today. Therefore, we would like to invite everyone to acknowledge the ancestral homelands they are physically situated in today. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. Today, we acknowledge the practices of settler colonialism within the United States and uplift Native perspectives into our ways of thinking. Please check out this website to identify the local Native tribes that you are currently situated in, and feel free to put yours in the chat. In addition, we please have you also put your introduction in the chat box. And I'm going to share it in the chat here. We're also excited to share that our commission is actively recruiting new DB members. Involvement in the directory provides the opportunity for ongoing engagement with colleagues with a shared interest in international education and cross-cultural learning. We have up to 11 open positions. The application deadline is Monday, May 20th, 2024, 11:59 p.m. Central Time. The application and related information can be found on our link tree here. And finally, I would like to share that we are raising funds to support convention travel for international graduate students. We hope you consider supporting our commission's fundraising campaign. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 before ACPA 2025. Please use the link to donate to support our fundraiser. And now to our faculty and residence-elect, Dr. Bista.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Krishna Bista. I'm a professor of higher education in the Department of Advanced Studies, Leadership and Policy at Morgan State University, Baltimore, Maryland. I am faculty and resident-elect for the Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to share a land acknowledgement for my institutions for this session. Morgan State University was founded in 1868 as a Centennial Biblical Institute and named after Reverend Morgan. So we recognize the enduring significance of this land and waterways for the nations and many indigenous communities who live here today. So today's presentation, today's session is titled Unsilenced Voice, very significant in contemporary and ongoing, tensions around the countries and nations. We have 2 presentations for this session. Our first presentation features a personal scholarly narrative by Kriti Gopal, a doctoral candidate at the Indiana University Bloomington. And then we have our second presentation features the Critical Duoethnography by Milad and from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Elmira from the University of Iowa. who currently works as an analyst, and we'll be taking questions as well as we move forward. So we begin with the first presentation. I welcome everyone again, and the floor is over to Kriti. Kriti.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bista. I hope everybody can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you so much for letting me know that. I just need a moment to share my screen. So give me 1 second. I'm trying to figure that out. Okay. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for joining today's session. As Dr. Bista said, my name is Kriti Gopal, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am currently a Global Strategies Officer with the University of Texas at Austin. I have also identified in my previous life as an international student. I think part of the journey is still ongoing because I am also completing my doctorate from Indiana University Bloomington. Before I go on with my presentation, I do want to take a minute to give my land acknowledgement and pay my respects to the land that I'm presenting from. So in doing that, I would like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the indigenous lands of the Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coshada, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coali Tucan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous people and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. In acknowledging this land and the indigenous people who are inextricably connected to it, I also want to acknowledge the need to continue to learn about, celebrating, and being mindful of the land and the indigenous peoples connected to it. I also want to acknowledge the need to continue the work of decolonization and learn from and honor with gratitude and appreciation the indigenous peoples of this land. So I did borrow the second part of this land acknowledgement from the Roots and Wings Festival, which I believe occurs in Austin. And I am truly committed in doing my work. I know that I'm not fully there in understanding, the intricacies and the complications that are associated with the land acknowledgements that we do give and honor, but I want to be mindful that that work is much ongoing and needs to be done within the space of higher education. And I also wanted to put this useful resource that I personally find helpful. And if you visit the website, you will see that it not only gives you information about the local tribes in the area that you're representing, but it also tells you a little bit about their history, what is going on, and how you can also be involved in those communities. So I don't know if that there's a way for you to click that right away, but I do hope that you will borrow that address and visit that to do your due part and diligence in acknowledging the histories that we do want to honor. So moving on to my presentation, I want to take a moment to also tell you a little bit about who I am and what has brought me to this topic and this journey. And I think when I explain that in a second, you will understand why this topic is so important and why I'm so passionate, even though there may be very few studies or research that currently exists in studying this specific population. So for me, I think my own journey has played a big part of, being and bringing me to this topic of studying Indian international student experiences in the US. And that started for me, I think, a decade ago when I began my own journey as an international student in the United States. Being the first one in my family to come abroad, in my immediate family, and to also have the chance at attending college, I think both of those experiences were the very first for me. And so in doing that, I think I initially struggled a lot to make sense of what the US education system was really about. Of course, I had knowledge about the programs. I knew what I wanted to pursue, but I didn't know much about, I think, the cultural relevance. I didn't know much about the organization of higher ed in the United States. And I think much of that journey came to me in a way of experience. So I took the route of experiential learning where I found myself oftentimes asking many questions. And I think to this date, even though I may have moved largely from that student experience, that questioning remains to understand why something is a certain way or why there are structures in place and what those structures do within higher ed. And I think in doing that, I got to learn a lot more about different programs, different offices there are on campuses to really help students navigate that collegiate experience or journeys, as you may want to call it. And I think in doing that, many years later, as an undergrad, then as a grad, and eventually as a doctoral student, I think it paved my way into the world of student affairs, where I started asking more intentional questions about who international students are. And I think also wanting to understand specifically about students from specific countries or subpopulations. So today I'm going to be focusing largely on Indian international student experiences. Again, like I said, stemming from my own journey. And for me, I think still a lot of questions remain because I'm still in the final phase of that doctoral journey. So once I finished my undergrad, I went on to pursue my graduate studies from the University of Central Missouri, which is a state school in the Midwest. And then I went on to work in higher education for a little bit, where I was working at Dartmouth College as a education abroad advisor in their international office. And then I also found myself in that same year, I think that was in 2017 or 18, where I was struggling to make sense of higher ed and how that works for someone that is wanting to find a work visa or find pretty much like their sense of belonging in higher education. Because as many of you may also know, that higher ed tends to be a very difficult route or path for someone that is trying to gauge or get a work visa as well. Even though we say that it is very diverse, we are very open to welcoming a lot of people, and there is diversity in terms of programs and the services that are offered. I think the work visa piece is something that is often still not discussed in a broad sense, and there's work that needs to also be done in that aspect. And each of these topics that I'm talking about, I think, also make for their own individual study of going into depth and understanding how that actually plays out for the student, right from the time they begin their academic journey all the way until what they're doing in terms of their career. So as I've already shared, my research focus has remained within the international Indian student space, stemming both from my own journey, but also in wanting to understand why there is a lack of research to really understand and explore Indian international student experiences. I also talk a little bit about the global pandemic later in this presentation and how that I think has shaped my understanding of this ongoing experiences. And finally, I want to leave you all at the end of this presentation today with where I am headed on this journey and what it really means as next steps in the Indian student, in understanding the Indian international student experiences. So I want to start out with the literature, and again, many of you may be very familiar with this data, and I've also seen that this or something similar to this effect has been shared in another presentation that was held as a part of the colloquium. But as you all probably are already aware, that students from China and India make for the largest group of international students in the United States. And the second image that you'll see in the lower, that is more of a bar representation, shows really the growth. I should also say the steady growth of Indian international students in the US. There was a little bit of dip, as you can see, in the pandemic time, but at the same time, that number has gone up in the last year to where the numbers are back to being almost near the pre-pandemic level. And as you can see from this representation, it's also increasing. So in terms of the demand and supply, we all continue to know that US tends to be a popular destination, specifically for students from India. Now that brings me to my literature review, which the literature that we currently have really just a lot of it still continues to generalize international student experiences and also continues to look at them as a monolithic group, which we all know that when we consider aspects of diversity, given the socio-political background, given any situation that is unique to a student experience, it becomes a little bit of an unfair or unfamiliar approach, because that in a way reduces or almost erases what diversity levels are being represented by international students. The second point, I think, is also there is significant gap in the presence of Indian international students. That is what I have found in my ongoing pursuit of completing my doctoral journey. And specifically, when we look at issues like gender or program of study, or even understanding their financial background, there remains to be that gap in understanding who these students really are and what those students signify in terms of their stories and their experiences. I did add I do want to acknowledge that there was an article and there is a very significant study that has been done by Chenam Sethi and Bista, Dr. Bista, who is here in the session today. And Datta and Meghani have also studied aspects of the Indian student population. But as you can see, these are some of the handpicked studies that I can actually number and tell you that exist in the international student space of understanding Indian students' experiences. So clearly there needs to be more research when we look at the number of students that are in the system versus how much research is being done to really understand who they are and then developing services to help them be successful in those journeys. I also think there needs to be specific studies. And again, this point also was brought up in a presentation that was given by Dr. Deng, who talked about immigration policies, academic programs, social experiences, and also their intersections within the American higher education system. I think I say this at a very timely instance too, given that we've seen just alone in this week so much that is happening in the higher ed space. And when I take that to think about like what happens in a given year with international student experiences in the light of immigration or even academic programs, social experiences, clearly there's more work that needs to be done. And finally, to my last point, I think there's also a dearth of research in the transitional experiences of Indian international students, which despite them forming a small percentage in the US space, and as you have seen, there is a growth in the number of Indian international students. It continues to remain an understudied topic, as I've already stated before. So this then brings me to what possible ways or what is being done to study or explore Indian students' experiences. And one way in which we do that in the higher ed space is by using student development theories. So if you're not familiar, then I just put this image again at the lower part of the screen to give you an overview of what type of theories exist. Of course, a lot of these have been borrowed from the field of psychology and sociology, but I think the biggest problem is that all of these theories have been developed from a very Western perspective. And so when we look at students who are coming or traveling from around the world, I personally, as a scholar and as an emerging practitioner, have found it challenging to put myself in the light of these theories. Now, I'm not saying that I don't fit these theories at all or they don't relate to my experiences. However, I've also found a gap in trying to connect to these theories socially, culturally, and also when I look at the background experiences from the point of like geopolitical issues that do exist in having ties to my home countries versus the host countries. So what I argue in my study, and that I will get to like publish later on in the New Directions piece, is actually this idea of the kaleidoscope. And so going back to my previous slide, which really just gave you a very small overview, I think there needs to be more time that needs to be spent in discussing each of these areas. I think the kaleidoscope image that I want to present is actually that of bringing the student to the center of all of these theories, and then picking and choosing from different theories that exist in the student development space. But in doing that, within a kaleidoscope, I also want all of you to imagine the different aspects or different lenses of cultural, social, emotional, even political aspects that can exist within a student's given story. And so in doing that, not only do you allow space to bring in the theories that exist, but you also create that intentional space of bringing ideas or bringing those theories into motion that actually don't even exist right now. So I want to go back, and I know I'm running short on time. This presentation is not very long today, but I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the theory again. And so when I go back and I look at these theories, there are, let's say, for example, we have Schlossberg's theory or Josselson's theory. We also have Bronfenbrenner's theory, which does consider different aspects of a student's life. I think what I'm trying to say with the kaleidoscope is that there are pieces in the Schlossberg and Bronfenbrenner's theory that don't really apply from the lens of an Indian perspective, especially when thinking about Indian identities or what that means to be in a space that is predominantly white within the United States. So in bringing those aspects, so keeping the Schlossberg somewhere on the image here, but at the same time looking at the student individually to see what identity development or what work they have done in an individual basis, I think gives the opportunity to not only connect the gap there is in the research, but at the same time, also look at it from the perspective of what needs to be done in order to really meet the student where they are, and then take it from there, from the point of like program development or even support. So in also doing that, I think when we consider the kaleidoscope image, I think it allows to bring into effect some of these points that I think are very important when we consider the experiences of Indian international students specifically. I also think, and again, I know that this presentation specifically focus on Indian international students, but I also think that much work needs to also be done to understand like the subpopulation of international students there are within the United States. So by doing that, I think not only do we honor each of these diverse experiences that students bring, but at the same time, we also give importance to the changing perspectives there are in higher ed, and also with the changing trends there are within higher education, to consider different complexities there are with identity development as well. I also think it gives an opportunity to integrate the experiences that students have in higher education, given that my undergraduate experience from 10 years ago is going to be probably very different and dynamic for someone that is joining as an undergrad, let's say last year or in the years to come. So it also allows for that intentional programming to, really meet the students and consider what is not being done. And lastly, I think there is beauty in diversity, and it, I think, offers the space when given a chance to consider all these other points. It brings into the effect that there is always going to be dynamic and changes in higher education, but at the same time, by allowing for these intentional programs, I think there can be more helpful programming that not only like offers the student a chance to grow, but at the same time also allows them to be successful in those higher education spaces. So the methodology that I used for my project here was very similar to that of Dr. Deng's, which is the scholarly personal narrative. And I think in doing that, it really allowed me to bring out my story and connect the dots in terms of what is missing in terms of the research, and also by reflecting back on what is important to my story and why I need to highlight that. Again, I realize that I'm running out on time, but I want to leave this presentation with a few recommendations. So in talking more about my doctoral journey, which focuses again on Indian international student experiences, and I'm actually in the final phase of writing out my dissertation, what I'm learning, and I'm not fully allowed to share because it's not a published study, but some things that I want to leave you with this presentation specifically is for institutions to be better at understanding students' experiences and focusing on individual stories. I realize it's very easy for me to say that in this presentation, but when I say that, I think there needs to be work and there needs to be a shift in the way we approach how we are doing programming and how we have our program set up to support students. In order to invest on an individual level, it is going to take some effort and creative thinking in terms of finances, in terms of resources, in terms of training personnel. But in doing that, I do believe there can be a significant shift in how we approach in what we are doing in the international space, not just to help international students as a broad population, but also specifically an Indian student population. There is no doubt that there needs to be more research. And I think more research is coming out, right? Like there has been other dissertation studies I have seen as a part of my ongoing research that has focused specifically on Indian students. But I also think at the same time, it's very important to address these assumptions and stereotypes that continue to exist about international students. And lastly, I want to say that I think it also calls for policy changes in not just terms of visas or even the way we have our enrollment across the United States. But it also calls for specific changes that allow students to raise their voices and really consider their experiences in the light of the world events that do in a way impact and affect these student experiences. With that, I want to conclude my presentation. I welcome the opportunity to connect with all of you through email. So I'll share that in the chat in a moment, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Kriti. Appreciated. In fact, your story is the story of everyone. All of us, started our journey with the 2 pieces of luggage and a dream. Thank you for your sharing your story. Now we go to breaking the silence. from Milad in Elmira. So over to you for next 20 minutes or so. And I request the scholar in the room, please use chat room to put your questions. We'll take your questions right after our next presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, we can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. I'm not going to read the whole title, it's long, but we can stick to the bit breaking silence as part of it and really the gist of what we are going to talk about, and you will hear more about how these frames are studied. My name is Milad Mohebali. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, but we actually wrote this when we were in graduate school or just coming out of it. Elmira, could you introduce yourself too?
Of course, I'm Elmira Jangjou. I was a PhD student in educational policy and leadership studies at the University of Iowa. But currently, I graduated actually exactly last year this time. So, and started my new role as an analyst in Ithaka S+R, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on collaborative strategies and research for higher education. Happy to be here today.
Thank you. So broadly, we are going to go almost as our paper is laid out, give you a little bit of a background introduction, literature review, methods, and then our findings and discussion and implications. So really going in the same format of what you are usually used to as a research paper. If some of you are ready to potentially react and give me a thumbs up when I ask you a question, that might come handy in the next couple of slides. So as I paused here, I wonder, did you hear anything? No? Maybe you were wondering? So the slide was empty? Is it just a pause? What is it? I think that kind of, brings us to the background of this study. What is silence? What does it do? Is there meaning in it? I know this slide is empty, but it can still contain meaning. I actually wanted to say something by this slide. And instead of a land acknowledgement, I actually wanted to use this as a way of really thinking about what silences do in relationship to a structure of settler colonialism. If you think of all the global conflicts, things that are going and happening at the universities, we actually learn as much about what is said as we can also learn about what is unsaid or is not said. And also, when we say something, do we hear it? I can say, I'm on the lands of, and name the tribes. What does it mean to hear something? And can it become a form of silencing when we actually listen to something but cannot hear it and translate it? So really part of the background of this study is that what does silence contain? Can there be meaning in it? And what does that can tell us as a part of an inquiry? And also, what does it do? We actually think silence can do something. And that's really part of how this study has been shaped. So we really ground on a study into a really single focal point of a classroom experience. And classrooms are really important in graduate international experience. It is part of our socialization. As graduate students, we are often trained to become experts in different ways that really train us for our future careers. We almost have to make them take the role of the expert in our fields or in our domains of the study. And in that way, I think classrooms become even far more important in how they shape the students' experiences. We know a lot about the students' experiences in classrooms, in the sociocultural, sociolinguistic ways that it shapes how we show up in a classroom. but we seldom connect what happens in the classroom to really how we shape and how our journeys are shaped as an international graduate student. And that's where we are actually entering and really thinking, how does it do ethnography when you actually focus on the stories and expand that focal point and really expand it and find the meaning of it over time. And silence has been studied in the classroom experiences in many different ways, but not so much always in relationship to power, which is part of our study in terms of thinking about power structures and how power shapes silence, or who gets to be silenced, or how do we become silenced. So our research question was, what do classroom silences reveal about the processes that shape the journey of international graduate students in the United States, focusing on the stories as a focal point into exploring that question. In terms of literature review, we know a lot about the students, graduate international student experiences, the mental health, immigration process, career process, finance and well-being. So there's a lot that's, ongoing in the field that are really important topic. And then when it comes to classrooms and classroom experiences, we also know a lot. What happens inside of the classroom, how do students engage or do not engage? We just show up a couple of things in this literature. We kind of situate this work in the broader studies that happen. And also we know that silence happens in classroom. International students sometimes are silent, and different people have explored that meaning of silence. Like Kriti, we also have used from Dr. Bista's work and some of the work that has done in terms of thinking what other silences mean, for international students. Sometimes it's about their own cultural background, and silence has a different meaning for them when they show up in the classroom. Sometimes it's actually empowering for them to ground themselves in the cultural background that they come from, and they use silence to process, to think, and that's where they understand and learn. So there are so many different ways of thinking about silence. There's also more literature about how the silence is negotiated. Silence is not something one does or doesn't do. It's also something that happens in the social environment of the classroom. It's negotiated between the different people, students and teacher, students among themselves. There is lots of dynamics in it. And there are some studies that say, in the United States, particularly in North America, we see that the participation as a collective experience. So when the international students do not participate, sometimes they become the place of blame, that they choose not to participate, or they choose to be silent. Even though some studies say students actually sometimes choose to be silent when they feel like they are the cultural other. So overall, most of these studies really think, what is the larger context? Is it the Western context, for example, that really shapes what does it mean and how do we show up in classroom to shape what is the norms of it? If the student is silent, are they blame? What are they doing? It really affects. So we are bringing attention to that negotiated part, that there is something that happens and it's negotiated. And as a theoretical framework, we ground this study in two concepts. So I would give you a broad overview of it. One is epistemic injustice, which Riker, explains it as when a capacity of a person as a norm is undermined. It has really many layers, but for example, she gives an example of, for example, a black person in court in the United States saying their truth, and how it is heard, for example, with a white audience when they can hear it, but they don't assume that person is a full norm, and they undermine their capacity as a norm. Or another example, which is a little bit more complex, is when a population do not have the language to name an injustice that happens for them. So, for example, in the 60s, there was a shared common language in society about sexual assault. So people were experiencing sexual assault, but they didn't have a language to name it. So they didn't know that there was an injustice happening to them. So there's a layer to this. And then epistemic oppression happens when a repeated practice of silencing impairs a group's ability to speak and to be heard. So when something happens over and over, the group might actually start to question, maybe I have to be silenced. Maybe I don't actually know. I almost think of it in some way a way of gaslight. It's like you are put in a position that you start to question your own sense of reality, and you might as well not participate or think about what does that mean. With that, I would have Elmira continue to talk about the methods.
Thank you, Milad. So to better understand the silence that we were experiencing as international graduate students and explore ourselves, we decided to use duoethnography. We didn't just want to share our stories, but engage in a dialogue that we push each other actually to look at our experiences and silence in general from different perspectives. And the critical aspect of this methodology just helped us to examine the power dynamics in both in the dialogue that we were having together and also when we were criticizing the hegemonic spaces that we existed. As researcher participants, we also recognized how similar and different identities we had. For example, both Milad and I come from Iran, but we have different genders and different ethnic background. We both got our Masters of Science in different majors in different cities in Iran. Milad came to the US with an F1 visa, started his master's in education, graduated, and then started his PhD. But it was different for me because I came here as a dependent to my partner with an F2 visa. And I had to go through a status change to become an international student with an F1 visa. And then I started my PhD program, and Milad and I were at the same department, at the same university, but in different programs. And next slide, please. And also for data collection and analysis, we use the theory of being to help us to be present in dialogue and engage in a conversation together. And we use third thinking as a tool that helped us to center silence. And we started to self-reflect, recognize how our identities was impacting our experiences, the conversation that we were having. And we were trying to make sure that the power dynamics didn't silence us even in that conversation that two of us were having. And we tried to listen to one another and recognize how similar or different our experiences with silence were. And we recorded our conversation and we used it to report the findings. We also shared our own individual stories that we will talk about it in the next slide. So to very briefly go over my journey as a graduate international student, as I mentioned, I had to go through the status change because the F2 visa was so limiting for me. I was so interested in the field of education, but I didn't have any educational background in this field because I had a master's in agricultural economics engineering, now very relevant. But I applied for this PhD program in education, and unfortunately, I had a lot of difficulties securing funding. I went through a lot of financial difficulties. But when I was applying, I had this expectation that I want to go and learn about best educational practices, regardless of any specific country. But when I started the program, actually, I realized that all discussion was US-centered, and I had no ideas about it. And most of the students in the class, they were domestic students and they already had lived that experience, so they could very easily participate in the discussions. On the other hand, I was being socialized by the faculty, by my peers, to believe that the classroom is not a place to share personal experiences. If you want to show up as a professional, you needed to use theory to base your ideas in theory. So as a person very new in this field, I was having a lot of difficulties engaging in the conversations. And whenever I was sharing my ideas, there was a silence. And since I noticed this too much, I started to observing what's going on. What is this silence? How often does it happen? When does it happen? And what I was saying was that, yes, it was happening most of the time when people wanted to think more, reflect on an idea. Sometimes they would continue the same conversation, the same topic, or sometimes when something was not clear enough, people would ask clarifying follow-up questions. But when I shared, people would pause, and then no one would ask any questions, or they would change the topic just suddenly. And I was like, what was there a problem? I wasn't clear enough. If I wasn't clear enough, why no one asked any questions from me? And then I noticed that the silence following my speech was different than many other silences. So the strategy to cope with that awkward silence made me to become silence. Next slide, please. So I had given up involuntarily sharing my experiences because I didn't think they mattered. And then I started not to matter. I was feeling not academic enough, questioning my social and educational skills. But on the other hand, the education that I was receiving, it was helping me to learn about different models of equitable education, how it should look like. And I started to notice the systemic oppression that compelled me to blame myself and think that I'm not enough, I'm not a knower. And learning this education helped me to start thinking about breaking the silence. And the first step was sharing my experiences with people who I felt safe with, who I felt they care about my experiences. And the first step was starting this conversation with Milad, which followed up writing this paper.
Before getting to the point of me and Elmira actually starting to practice in doctoral journeys, I'll tell you a little bit quickly about my own journey. That I started in a master's program in higher education, and similar to Elmira, I felt like I didn't know so much about social theory. My background was in engineering before. I didn't know much about anything about US higher education, so there was a really big learning curve to actually feel like I could actually come and become part of the conversation in classrooms. So by the time that I got to a PhD program, I actually felt competent enough. And sometimes I feel like that might have been my fault, because when I came to the PhD, I felt now I know enough to be part of a conversation. So I was actually feeling good. And over time, sometimes I was silent, and part of it was intentional in the sense of, well, I don't know some of this stuff, as I think Kriti was also talking about that. It's that part of first generation. I'm coming as an international person. I'm learning processes. I was choosing to be silent so that I could learn processes, and I was then starting to take it up, and that's part of it, good part of the socialization. And at the same time, there were some silences in the classroom that felt just different. I wrote these, the silences, those were the ones that felt different. But sometimes a literal pause that wraps my contribution like a black hole into nothingness. And other times it was a form of silencing that redirected what I shared into something different, shape-shifting it into something that was not mine anymore. It felt weird, in a classroom, you share something and it just gets lost, or somebody else takes it up and then kind of say it in a different way, and then there are other people are nodding. So when I think of the classroom experience, it's almost confusing. I'm trying to think, how did what I said didn't land? Somebody else might have said something similar. It completely landed. So I was observing, I was trying to think how I can adjust to that environment. How could I be the person that get that external validation from other people that may not do what I said? How can I become more in that classroom experience? And that was the part about, how do I want to manage it? And similar to Elmira, I had to silence part of myself so that I wouldn't do the kind of things that I would say that are not noticed or not, that are not going to be followed up, that do not require other people to say it in a different way to get heard. So I think both of us in that sense had experienced it under, working around it. Part of our findings and thinking once we started talking about it is really starting to think, what is the content of that? So again, here is the epistemic operation that happens, which is structurally upheld when we think of academic norms, professional standards, financial and immigration constraints, as a lot of Elmira's stories and also mine talked about. And again, both of us in the face of that epistemic violence of silence, we managed to not give up completely our voice. If we chose to be silent sometimes, that itself was an exercise of power. So we really don't think of it as a oppressor kind of thing. We also exercise power, even though sometimes we had to choose to be silent. And we really want to bring and think about it in a power circulating in a space that we both exercise power, but also had to negotiate power. And one last thing that I wanted to note is that it's not so much on us versus them once me and Elmira type. We also noticed that we might have done the same thing to other people, even some of our American or domestic students in the classroom. So it's not like we never had any power or we didn't silence other people. So even though we are focusing on the aspects of international versus, in a domestic US context, we also bring to the fact the attention that we have done the same and it's actually far more complex. We want to highlight this very specific aspect related to graduate international students. And I know we are almost at time, so we may have to go a little bit faster in the next ones.
Yeah, I'll try my best. So engaging in this dialogue with Milad helped us to realize that, oh my God, we've been developing similar survival strategies. So we were trying to stop looking for external validation at some point, and we started to rely on our own internal voice and just focus on achieving whatever we thought that it's our own goals. And also another strategy was to exchange experiences with other international students, which was very healing and comforting. There were, of course, some different approaches to developing a stronger internal voice for each of us, depending on different parts of our experience. For example, for me, who I didn't have any fundings in the beginning, so financial issues was a big thing that's impacting my experience. So I needed to prove myself as a knower so that I would secure that finding. And that made me like, oh, this is a cycle that I should get out of it. So I should break the silence and use every opportunity that I'm finding to participate in the class discussion so that I can practice how to present my ideas. I deserve to be in this classroom and use that space. And for Milad, it felt like he was restricted by the academic norms that he used to believe, and he tried to confront them and find his authentic voice by practice. And of course, it was challenging for sure. We use all of these experiences just to offer some implications for research, policy, and practice that can disrupt these issues that we believe have an impact on students' lives, and we are all kind of collectively participating in this. For example, for research, we think that we should continue thinking about what the silence is, what are the roots of it, and also to look how the silence is impacting the international students from different sociocultural backgrounds. For practice, we think we need to imagine what the field of higher education can look like if we do not silence the international students and give them opportunities to share their unique voices inside the classroom and also outside of the classroom, especially now with the protests going on. Silencing the students can have a very negative impacts. And also thinking about practice, we all have a role in this, like faculty, higher ed leaders can provide safe learning spaces that international students can share their unique perspectives. And students also, we can find validating communities that would help us to cultivate that internal voice as knowers, which can help us also maintain our well-being, mental well-being as well. And for policy, of course, there are so many structural barriers, including the employment restrictions for the students that can impact our experiences in higher ed so much, so that it really needs to be considered and investigated. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a timely presentation. So both topics are so important. We have lots of unheard voices. I think that's the project we should be doing collectively. Thank you so much. So please continue sending your questions. I have received a few questions here. But before I read my questions, I'd like to give the audience, unmute and ask your questions to Kriti and Milad or, Elmira. I know you have a lot of questions. Whoever wants to go, it's fine with me. I know it's a silence, but it's still, we are thinking. It's like an earlier blank slide. And everyone was thinking, did something go wrong? Did video play? Or any technical issues, right? So that's what we have not returned, and our stories are not heard at all. Okay, please unmute your question, microphone, and you can read your question.
Sure. Sorry, I will be off video for today. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I'm just really curious. We see, I think, a significantly increasing visibility of such research. I mean, of course, each research is very unique, and we're always filling the gaps. And even when we say, there are not theories or frameworks that align with our experiences, I say our as a former international student and new immigrant. And we are really exploring integrating these new methodologies and everything. So there's a lot growing in the literature. But one thing that I observe as an educator, as an advocate for international students, like how are these findings, outcomes really changing something, if anything? So I'm just really curious, what do you think? And you already presented some implications, but the current education system in the US being very US-centric, in many ways. How do you think your research can change something more practically in our everyday experiences? Like, how do you see the opportunities to make this research more visible for policymakers, for educators out there?
In the interest of time, I'm happy to answer what I think my view is on this question. It's an excellent question. I think for me, it's going to take some creative collaboration from researchers, but also policymakers. And I think this might be already happening in the US space. And the way I see it is also continuing to show up, right? I actually put that in the chat when Dr. Bista was asking something earlier. He was sharing his story and that's what I reacted. But I think it's so important to not just do the research and then publish it in the avenues that are presented, but to also keep at it and keep being an advocate, despite how difficult or despite how unpopular that might be. And I also say that from my own ongoing experience, I have been told that my research is it's not linear, or it's not following a certain standard, or sometimes there is also challenges in terms of the methodology that I'm choosing or what I'm choosing to report in terms of what the participants shared. But I think it's a continuous process. There's never going to be a time where you just write something and then you say, okay, this is the effect, this needs to take place. It's, I think, a collaboration and also I want to say a work in progress always, because you have to check, right? What you're putting into effect, does that also have an impact? Is that changing things? Is that bringing change? Is that affecting any policy or any program that is already in place? So I think for me, that's what I would say it is. It's increasing those spaces, intentional spaces for collaborative efforts, not just on the researcher piece, but also having that opportunity to connect with the practitioner side of things. And most of all, I think, including student voices. We say so much about their research, we include these aspects, but I don't see that representation, unfortunately, and I don't see opportunities for students to be on the forefront of things. And I would like to change that. I will continue to fight for that as I am in those spaces.
With something, and I think everything Billy said was to the point exactly. And one thing I would add to that is for me and Elmira, I think we were always talking to graduate international students. And part of it was that every time we talk about this, most of them get it. They know what it is, they have experienced it. There is something about giving meaning to something that I think shifts how we position ourselves to it. Once you see it, once you know it, maybe you would feel less crazy into the space and you would be like, okay, it's not me. And then you can move on and maybe they take your voice. I mean, that's the part that we can't do. But I think at least naming it actually helps people to understand that it's not about them. I think sometimes we carry these feelings, like that silence almost sits in our bodies. I feel about that when I went to my job interviews and I still carried that silence. I still feel like somebody's not hearing me. Once, to me, part of that and part of this conversation is that for international graduate students to know that it's not about it. They might be able to actually remove it and do not speak from that weight that silence carries in their bodies, that they can actually own their voice. Now, I think both me and Elmira still struggle with that. I can say that once we name it, it worked out. We still carry that shame or questioning or all kinds of the things that you experience once it's happening to you. But I think the part is that at least we have a name for it, and at least we feel like it wasn't us. Okay, now let me try and move on with my life. So that's for me the most important part of this work, other than some of the implications that we already have in that paper.
Yeah, I wish I had a very good answer to this question. It's a very important one, but I think the way that I've been approaching it is just speaking up, just sharing my experiences, trying to let other international students know about my experience, helping them not to blame themselves for what they're going through, and using any opportunity that I'm given to raise awareness about this. And even for my current role that I have, I try to push my colleagues to think about the experiences of different groups of students and not forget about international students. And I think if one of the best approaches that we can take, wherever we see that we have some power that we can make it even smallest change, we should activate that.
Thank you so much. I think we should continue telling our stories, telling our, unfolding findings. The beauty is we have at least 2,000 studies come out every year on international student and scholar, and we should continue the moment. Yes, this is very powerful. Thank you everyone being here today. Our time for today is coming to end. But we would like to take a moment to thank our presenters and our audience for giving us their time and commitment to this work. We would also like to remind everyone that we are not completely done. Next week on May 3rd, we will have our final session titled Our Journeys to Career in Higher Education. We hope that you will please consider joining us again. And for the next piece of information, over to Ms. Lee.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Bistar and all our presenters today. Before you leave, could you please scan the QR code here? Yes, thank you, Dr. Bistar. If you attend 3 out of the 4 sessions in our colloquium listed below, you are able to receive a certificate of completion from us. And you must fill out the certificate sign-up form for each session by 11:59 on Sunday, May the 5th. And here is the code, and I'm also sharing the link on the chat. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A quick question: is the QR code to the same link, or is it a different thing?
I believe so. Yes, the same link. Yes.
Okay, cool.
And I'm also
you.
putting in the chat.